autonomous weapons or AI-enabled technologies, they're not something out of a science fiction. They're not in the future. They're very much already present.
We may not have the direct law, but we do have one of the most ancient principles of history, and that is the concept of human dignity.
There's the legality of the law, but there's also the legitimacy of the law.
From global treaty rooms in Geneva to grassroots movements across the global majority, the international community grapples with the ethical, legal, and political challenges posed by autonomous weapons systems. International law stands at a crossroads, grappling with the challenge of keeping pace with weapons that evolve faster than the rules meant to govern them. In a world increasingly shaped by data and algorithms, the power to decide who lives and who dies is shifting from human hands to AI-powered autonomous systems. These technologies are not emerging in a vacuum. They are born of existing structures of inequality and risk reinforcing systemic injustice under the guise of innovation and militarized notions of security. As global efforts to regulate autonomous weapons systems evolve, the urgent question becomes, who gets to decide the future of warfare, and on what terms?
As a human race, we recognize that we cannot create weapons that are beyond our control and that will have the powers to eliminate and take human lives.
The majority of states actually supports a legally binding instrument or a treaty around autonomous weapon systems.
Historically, it has been wealthy countries and more powerful countries that have been able to exert these technologies against less powerful people. And it has been traditionally people in less powerful positions and less privileged positions who've borne the brunt of these technological structures. We see structures of labeling people and identifying people as targets that may not accord with the requirements of legal structures.
We also have problems that are arising from more of an ethical perspective, we can call it like that. So for example, the systems, for them, a person is nothing more than a pattern of data. And this is known as a digital dehumanization. So instead of a person, the machine only sees labels or categories or data. Technology sometimes is thought as a neutral thing, but it actually is not. It reinforces and amplifies existing inequalities in society. When we look at bias, we have several bias that are embedded in the data sets or in the design or in the use of an algorithm. And the result of that is a specific harm and violence against certain groups.
These biases are coded into the systems that we have, simply because the people who also make these systems have their own social biases as humans.
So far, we see, I think, a lot of states talking about AI systems of this sort without really committing to any meaningful action on it, without feeling like they need to set out what are the parameters of that, what are the boundaries of that, at what point does it stop being responsible and become unacceptable. And certainly, from what we saw of lavender as it was reported to be used in Gaza, these systems seem to raise grave concerns about the sort of substantiveness of human moral engagement in the use of force.
Artificial intelligence is used as a categorization machine. So you create categories, you create labels, and you put people inside those labels and inside those boxes. And then those categories are used. And we saw in this past few months the destruction that was done in Gaza and how many countless of thousands of civilians' lives have been killed because you use AI to create this category, and then that becomes a legitimate target to be attacked.
And we recognize that this is happening within political systemic structures that themselves are not prioritizing of civilian interests and that are somewhat systematically dehumanizing and downgrading people. And these machine functions and algorithmic functions are simply helping to accelerate that.
So we're in a critical moment for the discussion because of the mandate of the CCW that they need to have some elements for a future treaty before the end of 2025. But the future is completely uncertain and the international dystopic situation that we are living.
This conversation is happening in the United Nations, in the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, so the CCW. And inside the CCW, we have the group of governmental experts on lethal autonomous weapon systems. And this specific body, it works under the consensus rule, which has been interpreted by states as if everybody needs to agree in order for something to be discussed or adopted.
I think the Global South has been really central to this because they are mostly interested in the humanitarian aspects of IHL, International Humanitarian Law. And they have tried to push for a legally binding instrument for autonomous weapon systems.
There are challenges with regard to Global South participation and the role of civil society, particularly because the Global South countries tend to have smaller delegations at these meetings.
You have the majority of states who support creating rules, support a prohibition, and you have a minority of states, because of this consensus rule or how they interpret this consensus rule, they're able to block discussions on this. And this is why there are many actors from civil society and states themselves who have been calling for states to explore other avenues of discussions. One example is the General Assembly, because there each state has a vote.
If we are talking about the Global South, we are talking about a huge group of states, and they do not have exactly the same view on things, but they can come together and say this is possible, that it was actually possible to have something that looks like international law, something that looks like a protocol, that looks like a treaty. And when they managed to do this, it became very possible for everyone to move to the next level.
The humanitarian perspective is being challenged today, but it was successful for 25, 30 years. And this is because of the collaboration of several actors, including global coalitions like Stop Killer Robots, in this case of autonomous weapon systems. We have been working with our countries very close for many, many years. And not only in the multilateral forums, not only at the United Nations, also in capitals, as well with our military people, with our scientists, with parliamentarians. In Latin America, we have CELAC, that is the Latin American and Caribbean Network on Human Security, where we have members in all the countries in the region.
The discussions initially were more directed towards just international humanitarian law and trying to reinterpret international humanitarian law so that the technology that we have now can fit into the old laws that we had. However, with the Global South in general, the idea is that the war, it cannot be separated from ethics.
Global South countries are not the ones developing this kind of systems, but they are going to be used as battlegrounds for their testing and deployment. So you do have this power dynamics in the development of the system that also plays into conversations about regulation that I'll touch upon.
And here, where we're talking about technological structures that to an extent are involved in categorizing and labeling people and assigning them to certain categorizations, inevitably those kind of categorization structures reflect power dynamics in themselves.
Despite the majority of states agreeing on the importance of regulating autonomous weapons systems, such norms are slow to emerge due to a range of political, economic, and strategic factors.
We have the whole basis for all law, which is peace. Probably the oldest principle of international law among human states and communities of any kind is that we will find other means than military force, than lethal force, to engage with each other. So if you take those two core principles, human dignity, protecting the individual, peace, protecting our communities, you have plenty of law to apply to the use of AI in any aspect of the military domain.
There are concerns around the unpredictability of the systems and whether they are capable of complying with the principles of proportionality, precaution, and distinction in attack. And also when we look at human rights law, there are concerns whether it is possible to comply with the right to life.
There are some basic principles that such a legally binding document should have. The first that comes to my mind is universality. The second is that such a document, you'll agree, has to be technically sound. The third principle, I think, in terms of the characteristics of such a document, would be that it has to be able to last in time. It has to have some adaptability, some durability.
You also have a problem because more than 60 states are not part of the CCW, the convention that we are talking about.
The reality and I think the tendency increasingly for civil society bodies to be facing some pushback in these forums, particularly in those UN processes that are based on consensus decision-making rules.
So whenever either a civil society or a state brings up the issue from a human rights perspective, that is blocked or that is completely, you have specific states who are against the discussion even happening, let alone taking specific decisions on that.
It's simply incorrect as a matter of law to say that only international humanitarian law applies to these weapons, even when these weapons are being used in an armed conflict situation. Every international lawyer will tell you that there is no situation on the face of the earth that human beings are involved in which international human rights law does not apply. I think the widespread view that, or emphasis, let's say, on international humanitarian law as opposed to all the other relevant areas of law is part of this movement toward trying to free up high-tech states to use military technology in any way that they politically believe is in their interest.
I think it's very clear when we look at the usage of technologies to oppress populations worldwide that these systems will be used for policing and for border control as well. So it's very clear that we do have an interest in broadening the scope in the sense of bringing this human rights concern.
What for me as an official supporting these processes is important is that member states themselves are recognizing these interlinkages between international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and international criminal law.
We may not have the direct law, but we do have one of the most ancient principles of history, and that is the concept of human dignity. Even if a soldier has a chance to take a lethal action, it is the right thing to do in many occasions not to do so, because humanity says don't. What is the point of taking out a sniper if you're going to kill 100 civilians at the same time?
Effective regulation of autonomous weapons requires inclusive frameworks that reflect the diversity of global points of view and address existing power asymmetries.
In a capitalist, patriarchal, racist, and colonial world, it is very clear that those systems, AI-enabled weapons and autonomous weapon systems, they're just another tool to dominate and to oppress. So it's important to see them within this broader framework that we're talking about of systems of oppression so that we can actually design strategies to counter them.
So we need states to come together, and we need a partnership of states that cuts across some of the sort of divisions of the global landscape. I would say that all legal treaties that are promoting civilian protection, the Mine Ban Treaty, Convention on Cluster Munitions, many others, They've been pioneered through partnerships between states in the global south and states in the global north, working with civil society and international organizations and with UN agencies, working together to find common ground. I think we really need to see that sort of partnership building now on this issue.
So the key is how to be partnerships to preserve and maintain the essence of the humanitarian perspective, to put in the middle the victims. There's different forums where the issues being discussed with different angles, with different memberships. So maybe we need to be creative and try to have something or different instruments with different levels at different forums, like the landmine treaty, that you have the protocol 2 of the CCW, and you have the convention of the prohibition of landmines.
In IHL itself, I know that some actors within these discussions are always against this kind of idea of including biases in the discussion. But generally, in IHL itself, we have international law that says we should not have what is called adverse distinction. And that means the selection of targets or the treatment of different targets based on race or on ethnicity, on gender, or any other identity aspects of human beings.
What moves peoples and leaders over time, maybe not in the short run, but over time, is compliance with international law, with this sense of order. We see countries are willing to follow those countries that stand for principle.
A lot of these conversations need to be had out of Western capitals and the usual locations.
These different regional processes, they have actually given us different views on what are the risks, what are the concerns for different regions. And they have very specific and distinct issues that they discussed in those different regional discussions. And I feel like this is one way to actually regulate autonomous weapon systems, because you cannot just have a few Western states dictating what happens.
I completely understand that is a concern of people, that it's difficult to fight against these trends, but at the same time, resistance has always happened and people already organize against the systems. I think it's very important. We have a range of campaigns to ban the systems. When we talk about getting a specific legal prohibitions or a treaty, that is one of the ways. That could be at the start of actions, but it's definitely not the end, because a lot more is needed to counter those narratives.
There's the legality of the law, but there's also the legitimacy of the law.
Some states who are not interested in getting a ban or aren't interested in banning this because they want to use the systems, then we still have grassroots movements against this. So I think that the ways to fight this kind of things, there are multiple ways. You can go through court, you can try to get regulation, or you can go in the streets, you can protest, you can write, you can gather support. This is the moment where people need to get together and organize and even push for the democratic institutions to be restabilized and also to respect our fundamental freedoms. I think this is the moment to do so. Autonomous weapons or AI-enabled technologies, they're not something out of a science fiction. They're not in the future. They're very much already present. So when we look at how several AI technologies are being used currently, we already see the harm that they're doing, and we already see the destruction that they're doing.
The struggle to ban or regulate autonomous weapons is not only a legal or technical issue, it is a deeply human one, rooted in principles of justice, equality, and peace. Yet the current architecture of international law and its multilateral forums often falter under the weight of political inertia and power imbalances, leaving critical voices, especially from the global majority, at the margins. The future depends on the alliances we forge today to ensure that international law evolves with integrity and courage, and that technology serves life rather than automates its destruction.